CISSP and other certification programs will talk about is thinking like a manager. I'll take that a step further and say thinking like a business owner. So really, when you're thinking like a business owner, you're thinking, I don't have millions of dollars to spend on whatever I feel like today. I have a very set budget, and I need to make sure that with the pot of money that I have at my disposal, I can make my organization as secure as possible, right? So that's where these targeted risk assessments and targeted risk mitigation comes into play. So with this organization here, instead of recommending a solution to something in the green, which may cost $20, $30, $40, $50,000, I can recommend things in the yellow here that may cost the same amount of money, but they're going to have the biggest ROI for my client. Those things, those recommendations that I make then make their way to a product roadmap. So that roadmap is going to be what is the gap? So you can also think of it like a gap assessment and then a plan, right? So gap being kind of the difference between where you are and where you need to be, and what is everything in between and how do you fix that? That makes its way into this assessment. That makes its way into this plan. Then we can plan for the next 4 quarters, right? We can plan for the next 2 years, the next 3 years, depending on the organization. These assessments really should be conducted annually, so I don't recommend planning really any more out than like 12 to 18 months because we should be reevaluating, right? And our risks may change, so our plan needs to change. So as we make the product roadmap, we should have clear milestones that definitely call out how are we going to know this is complete, right? And that'll should call out the key steps. So let's say we want to implement MFA because we don't have MFA. So that may say in Q2, we want to have MFA implemented. Well, what is a milestone? Is it just that MFA exists in your environment, or is it that all users have MFA? And is it, let's go a step further, MFA is deployed, that's great, but are your applications actually requiring MFA? Are you tied to single sign-on? Are these types of things in place to make MFA a forced requirement, not just it exists, right? And that's where those product plans and roadmaps become incredibly important. Talking a little bit about standards and assessments. So this is what can govern a lot of our security assessments. So if organizations are regulated, understanding their regulatory bodies, right? So I deal with a lot of clients that are SEC, which is the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission. I think there's, my team has told me, but I apologize, I forgot. There are a lot of financial regulatory bodies in India that would be similar to the SEC. Sorry, Lokesh, go ahead.
That is SEBI, Security Exchange Board of India.
This is what can govern a lot of our security. There you go. Yeah, Lokesh told me yesterday, and I did forget, so that's on me. Bodies, right? So I deal with a lot of clients that are SEC. So I deal a lot with like the SEC, right? And so similar bodies in India. My team they have told me, but I apologize, I forgot. There are a lot of financial regulatory body requirements and guidelines at the same time, right? So they'll tell you what you have to do, but not how you have to do it, which makes it a little bit confusing. And that's where layering on these types of things really comes into play. So let's take the SEC's requirements for Division of Examinations. This is their security framework, if you will, for their regulatory body. There's on the slide here, you'll see kind of the 7 key domains of that, how we assess against that, et cetera. You then have your subcontrols, and you should assess against those subcontrols. So when we're doing those audits and those assessments, these are the types of things we can use as guidelines and frameworks to conduct assessments. I'm doing assessments in NYDFS. We've got HITRUST. Lokesh dealing with HITRUST now. We're dealing with, obviously, the SEC. I've done NIST 800-171, 853. CMMC is a big one in the U.S. for the Department of Defense right now. ISO 27001, SOC 2, so on and so forth, right? MAS, Monetary Authority of Singapore, right, is one that's kind of up and coming for our APAC region clients. But all of those have different requirements and different things that you will assess against. When we conduct those assessments, we should definitely be gathering evidence, right? So you don't ever want to just kind of take people's word for things. Not that people are necessarily going to tell you false truths, but they may not necessarily know. And we talk about those policies we talked about earlier being a reference to a 5-year pipe dream that they may or may not ever get to. If you just review those pipe dream policies, you may get a false impression of an organization's security posture. So understanding their real posture and collecting evidence, we call them artifacts, of their posture and actually proving the things that they say that they do is going to be key and crucial. when you talk about conducting assessments, you talk about conducting audits. The overall goal here, what we have to understand and what we have to make sure that we make evident to people that we support, and this ties back to kind of the CISSP ethos, right? Is we're really trying to prevent organizations from having to suffer security incidents. So if we hide things or if they try to hide things to us, it's only going to hurt them because there's going to be a vulnerability or a risk that doesn't get detected because we were kind of misled. So we need to make sure that we're doing our part to not be misled as security professionals, and that we're expressing to the client the overall goal of these assessments and audits, right? It's not a test that we're hoping that they fail. It's something that we're hoping that we can kind of come together and cooperate, and then overall get them to a secure posture. So we talked a little bit about measurement and monitoring. So again, if you're not measuring something, you're never going to improve it. So as you can see, a lot of these kind of key things tie together, right, into risk and risk assessments and mitigating risk. Now we tie into monitoring and management. So understanding our key performance indicators, our KPIs. This on the screen, you'll see kind of a GRC platform overview. What we're measuring here is the overall posture score. We're measuring, and this one's using CIS V8 as a baseline framework. You can swap with NIST, ISO, doesn't matter. Pick your poison. It's going to be the same thing. But overall, we're trying to track what are our risks, right? What does this look like to an attacker? What could be exploitable in our organization? What is our compliance if we are compliance regulated? How are we being compliant with our requirements? What are the domains in which we have weaknesses and strengths? Again, if we have weaknesses in some domains, those may be where we want to direct some of our revenue or our resources towards mitigating risk. What are our open tasks? Are we actually tracking those tasks we talked about before? And are we completing tasks? Again, key things that we need to understand from a security standpoint. And then task progress. So this can tie into things like phishing and training, right? Running phishing awareness simulations. Are we tracking the phishing awareness simulations that our users are going through? If we're not tracking who our clickers are, our repeat clickers, what types of campaigns are they most likely to fall for, right? All of those tie into measurement and monitoring, because then once we have the data and we understand the data, we can then realign our training, our continued efforts to be something that is designed to mitigate the losses and the items that we found in our measurement of data, right? So take, for example, something I see a lot. We run phishing awareness campaigns. Let's say we run 6 of them within a year. And we find that in those campaigns, we have a significant amount of clickers related to Microsoft update your password, for example. But we have no clickers when it comes to DocuSign or Google Meetings, right? Well, why would that be? So that's where we as security professionals have to understand that and digest that data. So we can say, well, in this organization, for example, they use Microsoft O365. They don't use G Suite. So they are going to be more likely to click on Microsoft password resets because that's a product that they're familiar with and an organizational technology that they're familiar with and they use every day. They don't use Google Meetings. They don't use DocuSign. That's why they didn't click those, because they don't care about them, because it's not prevalent in their environment. So that tells us that this organization is doing a good job at recognizing their technology, but there may be a little bit of false trust with items that actually pertain to the technology in their environment. So that would be a weakness that opens them up to attackers that take the time to understand their environment well enough to do targeted campaigns, right? So that's how we would take that measurement and turn that into action. So we talked a little bit about organizational structure. We're going to talk about org structure when it comes to 2 key things here. One being kind of the overall organization, the other being the information risk council or information security team, incident response team. I see a lot of different names, business continuity team. But we're going to talk about it in a couple ways. We'll talk about it with org structure first. So understanding that the CEO or board of directors is kind of at the top of the food chain. Some organizations will place the COO as kind of a second level in between. I personally, as a security professional, advise against that. I advise in the next level being kind of a horizontal line beneath the CEO, and that should include the rest of your C-suite, right? That should be your CTO, who's in charge of all the technology in your environment. Usually things like products, internal IT, things like that will typically report to the CTO. So there is a natural tendency to have security also report to the CTO because it's part of technology, right? If you're running internal IT and the security for that IT and it's all under the CTO, that kind of makes sense. The problem with that I've seen is that the CTO has very specific goals for his organization and his teams relating to the advancement of technology and the advancements of user experience, things like that. That's not always the same goal that the CISO has, right? And that the security-focused personnel have. Security-focused personnel are not necessarily as focused on the advancement of user experience. They're more focused on the advancement of security, right? And preventing attacks. That's where we as security professionals can really try to do our part to understand the user experience as well. So I see a lot of security professionals in the industry that will kind of take it as, well, my job is to make security as strong as possible. I don't care what the users experience. I don't care how hard it is. That's not my job. They can just deal with it because security is more important. That's not the case, right? And that's going to cause us to alienate ourselves from the rest of the organization. And overall, then nothing gets done. And then you have no security in place anyway. So kind of having that hard-nosed approach will not always get you to where you want to go. What I found to be the most successful is understanding what in your organization is the key deliverables, understanding your organization structure and posture and all the things that we've already talked about today, and then making recommendations that relate, right? So if, for example, I want to increase my password policy, or let's say, so I want to increase my password policy, and I want to get it to 16 characters. It's currently 8, right? What can I do to get it to 16 characters while also making recommendations that are going to better the user experience? So I may make recommendations tied to enacting single sign-on, right? Getting a single sign-on vendor in place and using single sign-on so that my users don't have to log in at all anymore, right? I may talk about increasing password reset frequency. So instead of having to reset every 6 to 9 months, maybe we reset once a year, or we don't reset at all, right? NIST guidance around password resets for arbitrary reasons has changed to where it's no longer required. So maybe I make those kind of give and take recommendations, right? Hey, if we can increase our password policy to 16 characters, we can also get SSO rolled out so that users don't actually even have to log into these 5 applications that they normally do. And I'm willing to kind of lead that effort, right? I'm willing to kind of take charge of implementing that and making sure that gets done. So that's something where the CISO and the CTO should play kind of closely together, but definitely not one underneath the other. Now, kind of shifting gears a little bit to talk about the incident response team, information risk council, business continuity team, whatever you want to call it, right? This is really your overall team of experts within their respective team, their respective division, if you will, that are going to come together in the event of an incident. So this is going to tie to incident response, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But information risk council in this example here. So having an executive sponsor, right? Who is the executive sponsor of the team? That could be, in a lot of cases, it's the CISO. If they don't have a CISO, that could be the CFO. It could be the COO. It could be whoever it really needs to be, the CTO. And that's going to be the person that really is the one that's going to make the items that are said by the Information Risk Council largely accepted by the team, right? If I, as a director, say, hey, we have to do this because I'm in charge of the Information Risk Council and that's what I'm telling you to do, you're going to have VPs, you're going to have senior VPs, senior directors, et cetera. They're going to feel like they don't have to listen to me because I rank beneath them in the overall org structure, right? That's where that executive sponsor is a key role. That executive sponsor, I now speak with the authority of that executive sponsor when I make recommendations out of the Information Risk Council. So if I say something as a director, but it's coming through the executive sponsor of a CISO, that's going to be a key change in the dynamic of the organization to make sure that we get the buy-in and support that we need. That's also going to allow us to get the support from the executive leadership team, right? How do we know the CEO is listening? Well, we know he's listening if it comes from the CISO or the CFO or the COO as opposed to Director Chad, right? Obviously, Information Risk Council should have information security on it. I feel like that goes without saying, but security should be represented on the Information Risk Council here. Technology being another key support, right? You should definitely have your technology representation. Legal, right? So legal comes out to be a very key role. So we talk about, your general counsel, outside counsel, your legal counsel. In the event of a security incident, it's very important to understand what you're legally obligated to report, what you're legally obligated to communicate, and how you're legally obligated to communicate that, right? So if I were to ask kind of everybody here what constitutes a breach, we may or we may not know, and that may change region to region, right? What constitutes a security incident? Again, we may not know, we may know. It changes region to region. None of us are professionals in every single region, right? Even when you get your CISP, it doesn't mean that you all of a sudden are a lawyer, right? So having a lawyer, having legal counsel on the team as well, that's going to be able to kind of plug the gaps in understanding law. Human resources. So this is, and I would say even marketing can play a role in there as well. And that's really your communication, both internally and externally. A lot of the time we see, unfortunately, a lot of security incidents are caused by internal employees, right? Whether it's accidental or purposeful. So having human resources on the team definitely helps to kind of tie the loose ends there and make sure that we are able to, now referencing legally, but also kind of just in the most human resource kind of manner, communicate that both internally and externally to employees and our staff, our customers, the public, etc. Engineering really ties to kind of information technology. And then operations really tying to kind of round out the sales and, in our case, a lot of trading, right? Things like that. Understanding the other pieces of the business. So security and technology cannot operate in a vacuum. We talked a little bit earlier about needing to understand the user experience. This is where operations and that user team really comes into play. Resource management. So this, again, this kind of references our risk assessments that we talked about earlier. So understanding annualized loss expectancy requires us to understand single loss expectancy and then annualized rate of occurrence. So when we say single loss expectancy, if I lose my laptop, that costs X amount of money. That's not only the amount of money that the laptop costs, but it's also the amount of money of data that's on my laptop. So when we talk, hey, we want to implement BitLocker. Well, how much is it going to cost us to implement BitLocker? Let's say it's going to cost us $100,000. And let's say we have a significant amount of PII and other secure information on our laptops, right? And so let's say each laptop has a single loss expectancy of $10,000, right? That means that every laptop that we lose, the laptop itself maybe costs $2,000, and the data within that laptop costs maybe $8,000 for simple math in this conversation. So that gives us a single loss expectancy of $10,000 per laptop. We then need to understand what is our annual rate of occurrence, right? So let's say we lose 8 laptops a year in our organization. If we understand that losing 8 laptops a year gives us our annual rate of occurrence of 8 per year, that times our single loss expectancy seems like very simple math, right? It's going to give us our annualized loss expectancy, $80,000 a year. So now if we want to go, so that's how we quantify that risk in an actual dollar value. So what is the dollar value of not having BitLocker? Well, the dollar value of not having BitLocker is that $8,000 of data that's on our laptops that is now available where our laptops lost, stolen, etc. Right? If that was encrypted, if we encrypted our hard drives with BitLocker, we now can mitigate not the $2,000 loss of the laptop because the laptop's lost either way, right? But we can mitigate the loss of that data. We're significantly less likely for that data to be exposed. So that $8,000 loss of data is what we're talking about in that case. So when we talk about BitLocker, let's say it's going to cost us $20,000 to roll out BitLocker. Well, we said 8 laptops a year, and we can mitigate the $64,000 worth of data loss, right? $8,000 of data times 8 laptops, $64,000 in annualized loss expectancy. So just spending, $10,000, $20,000 on rolling out BitLocker makes sense. Yes, it's got a payback period of less than a year, right? It's got a payback period of like 4 months. So that's going to make a lot of sense to make that change and to invest those resources, because overall, we're actually going to save the company money in a year, right? In really like 4 or 5 months. So understanding that and being able to put that into numbers is what's going to get you the buy-in of the executive leadership team, right? That's a key. I can't stress it enough. That is a key performance or a key understanding item there is that being able to put things into quantifiable numbers is what's going to get you the buy-in of CFOs, COOs, CEOs, right? Everybody who looks at charts all day long, that's what they're going to look at and go, oh, a chart that says I save money in 5 months, let's do it, right? They're not necessarily, yes, they're happy to get the security in place, but they're also going to be happy to save money. So if we can do both, we win. Talking a little bit about incident response. So here we're looking at kind of the NIST incident response framework: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Very key framework item here, right? For both CISSP, for just kind of your life in security in general. Identify, right? How are we going to identify threats as they come in, right? In real time, how are we identifying things? This ties to your SIM, your SOAR, things like that. So if you have a SIM tool that's aggregating logs, and then those logs, the purpose of kind of running them through a SIM is not just to aggregate logs and put them in a folder somewhere and hope that somebody goes and looks at it at some point. That's not a SIM, right? What the SIM is doing is taking those logs and actually it's you're developing your SIM to understand your environment and actually make recommendations and or alerts based off of threats that it's seeing in the environment, right? So if somebody logs in from a country that they've never logged in before, right, that would be an alert that would trigger within your SIM. Let's say an impossible travel is a big one, right? So Lokesh logged in today in India, and then 30 minutes from now he logs in Korea, right? Is that something that's possible for him to do in 30 minutes? No, right? There's no possible way in 30 minutes he got from India to Korea and logged into his computer, right? So that would be an impossible travel. That shows a sign of compromise, right? Or at least some sort of security incident going on. That would be a key alert. So this helps SOC teams and risk response teams to then be able to protect, detect, respond, and recover, right? Because they're able to not have to look at 18,000 logs a day, right? They're able to really focus on those key alerts. So how do we identify threats? How do we identify vulnerabilities? How do we identify our key assets, right? All of those things kind of come into play there. How do we protect our assets, right? So this is where we can talk about some of those mitigating controls that we talked about earlier, right? How do we have BitLocker in place, things like that to protect our assets? Do we have an EDR tool deployed, right? Do we have a SentinelOne or Microsoft Defender or any of these kind of EDR tools, endpoint detection response tools in place? Detect. So now we actually are in the event of the security threat happens, the security incident happens. How are we going to detect that, right? This ties to our SIM. This ties to our EDR tool. This ties to kind of our anything that we're doing to be able to more rapidly detect threats. And then how do we respond to those, right? So this ties to your SOC team. This ties to automation within your SOAR tool. This ties to really your overall ability to respond in an incident. So this, I like to say that SOC teams should operate under the idea of better to ask forgiveness than permission, right? Especially depending on the criticality of events. So if you have a critical event, if using our Lokesh logging in from Korea example, if he logs in from Korea, do I want my SOC team to try to call his supervisor, or do I want them to block his account, right? I would rather that SOC team block his account, disable his access, or better yet, have an automation tool in place that says this travel was impossible, immediately cut off access. And then let's try to call Lokesh and say, hey, are you in Korea by chance, right? No? Okay. Then something's going on. Now we need to reset password. Now we need to investigate, right? I would rather Lokesh get mad at me that I blocked his account first before calling him and before calling his supervisor because he lost 30 minutes of work time, right? Because I blocked his account. I would rather that than get to a security incident from an attacker that got access to his credentials and exfiltrated data off of our systems, right? And then recover. So how do we recover, right? So recover can mean a few different things. It can mean how do we improve, right? And how do we make sure that we recover from this incident and then make sure that we're more prepared to deal with incidents like this in the future. It can also mean recovering from restoring backups, from being able to return to normal operation, right? One of the key indicators for CISSP was that you're not truly recovered from an incident until you're back to operation within your primary environment or whatever becomes your primary environment, right? If you return to operation in a cold site, right? If you spin up a cold site and you take 3 weeks or a month getting into this cold site and that becomes your new hot site, that's fine. That's your new primary work environment. You're not going to go back to the other one in any reasonable amount of time, right? So if we're going to declare this cold site, our now hot site, our now primary work environment, that's okay. We can do that and we can be recovered. But if we're operating off of, hey, we had a compromise, so we're going to spin up virtual desktops and we're all going to live off of virtual desktops for the next 2 months until we can get back to our laptops, that's not recovered until you get back to your primary operating environment, right? And that was kind of key for CISP. I'm almost done, I promise. Vendor and third-party risk. So this is something we're seeing a lot more now than we used to. As organizations are getting better at understanding their controls and getting preventative controls in place, getting EDR systems deployed, almost everybody has MFA now, right? It's barely a recommendation anymore because almost everybody does that off the gate. Third-party vulnerabilities and third-party risk has become significantly more prevalent as an attack venue or attack vertical for potential attackers, right? So that's where vendor management becomes a very crucial thing. So when you talk about vendor management, you talk about kind of identifying your vendors. So you're in the vendor recruitment process and you say, hey, we want to bring on a new vendor, right? You really should kind of go through all of the stages, kind of these 7 stages shown on the screen here, or 8 stages shown on the screen here, around identifying the vendor, evaluating the vendor, conducting due diligence, right? You should always conduct due diligence prior to onboarding a vendor. This could include reviewing their SOC reports, if applicable, sending them due diligence questionnaires, right? Understanding if they've had a breach, what security protocols they have in place to prevent a breach, who has access to your data, where is your data stored, right? In the U.S. Department of Defense, when you talk about like CMMC and NIST, there's a huge piece around data storage, right? So there's something called FedRAMP, which is basically FedRAMP low, moderate, high, etc. Microsoft has its kind of FedRAMP authorized version. I think it's GCC and GCC High is Microsoft's kind of DoD or FedRAMP approved versions. They may have changed the names. That was about 1.5 years ago that I dealt with those. So they have kind of their commercial, and then GCC and GCC High. And that's all around understanding data storage. So is your data stored onshore? Is it stored in friendly territory? Is it stored in hostile territory, right? So if they're storing data within China, for example, that may be something that the U.S. Department of Defense does not want, right? For kind of data storage within kind of its approved regions. When you go through kind of risk mitigation, so after running that due diligence, you understand we talked about doing risk mitigation and risk assessments on ourselves, right? As an organization, we really should be directing that same effort towards our vendors, right? So when we do that risk evaluation of our vendors, we should run them through a mitigation process. What recommendations can we make to our vendors to make sure that they're properly protecting our data? Then that goes through kind of procurement and onboarding and ongoing monitoring. Vendor offboarding is kind of the end of the cycle, right? This vendor, we've had them for 20 years. We're now selling the business and offboarding this vendor. We need to make sure that we properly ensure the disposal of our data from that vendor, right? How is our data? We don't want that vendor to have our data for 30 more years because we never made sure that they deleted it, right? Continuous improvement, right? So this ties to, if we're doing everything properly that we've talked about so far, we need to make sure that we're continuously monitoring and continuously evaluating. Security is not a one and done game. It's not something that you do once and say, hey, that was fun. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good evening over there now.
Yeah. Right? Good evening, sir. So this is Raghav Joshi here. Actually, what I wanted to know was, through your experience over the past years, I would like to know, how do you ensure that the organization suffer minimal reputational damage and brand value degradation in case of breach, or we can say any unfortunate incident?
That's a good question. That's a great question. So Brand reputation is one of the hardest things to quantify, right? It is absolutely something. There is no real formula for calculating brand, or reputational damage. I know a lot of organizations have tried to create one, but it really is just so widespread that it's almost impossible. There's organizations like Facebook, Meta, that have had so many incidents over the last 15 years that it's honestly scary, and nobody cares, right? Everybody kind of just continues to do what they're doing, and they still have a Facebook, right? So obviously their brand reputation damage is a lot less than, let's take a recent one, LastPass, right? LastPass had a data breach. Their brand reputation was kind of in the toilet. It'll probably take them a long time to recover. So when we talk about how do we mitigate that, a lot of that's going to tie to our preventative controls, and how are we kind of protecting our customer data. The things that I've seen come down to, look, we're not going to have a perfect environment that no attacker can ever penetrate, right?
Right.
I like to think that, you're not the smartest person in the room, right? And so if there is an attacker, if you can think of something to stop somebody, there is an attacker out there who can think of something to get around that, right? So everybody is susceptible. What I have found is that most of the time when organizations suffer significant reputational damage, it's because not only did they have an event, it's because they weren't doing the things that they were supposed to be doing in the event, right? And so when you talk about, I think it was Uber recently, they were trying to hide information, right? So they were trying to destroy evidence, and they were trying to hide that the attack happened, and what the extent of the attack was, and what loss was suffered, things like that. That leads to further reputational damage, because not only did you suffer an attack, you also tried to hide it, and that shows that really shows the overall character of an organization, right? When we think about personal character, you don't want me to lie to you, right? Why would I want a company to lie to me and try to hide things from me? So ultimately, it comes down to do what you say you're going to do, right? Stand by your policies and procedures. If you say that you're encrypting data, you better be encrypting data. Don't say that you're encrypting data and then not do it, right? That's going to further the reputational brand damage more than just the attack would.
Correct. Thank you, sir.
So hi, this is Ganesh here. Am I audible?
Yep.
Sure. Thank you. What I would actually like to know is what are some commonly faced challenges by companies while implementing IT governance, and what are the various ways to overcome it?
I'd say from what I see, there's two kind of key challenges. The first one, another great question. I think the first one really being around thinking that they don't need it, right? Especially in that kind of small to medium-sized business. There's still kind of this misconception that, hey, we have MFA in place, so we're good, right? Or, hey, we use Microsoft Defender, so we're fine. Nothing will happen to us, right? So there's kind of that misconception that they don't need it. And then the second misconception is really just around budget and resources, right? And cost. IT governance has costs associated to it, right? One, paying for the people's time. Two, paying for those assessments, paying for the mitigating controls that come out of it, right? It all costs money. So those are really the two kind of key struggles that we face. I'd say the best way to get around those struggles or to mitigate those and kind of push projects forward really ties back down to that, to those key kind of controls related to budget, right? So looking at this screen here for resource management, it's really going to tie down to this. So this is what's going to allow you to speak a language that they understand. Even if they don't think they need it because they don't think that they're going to gain anything from it. How can I put it into terms that they'll understand? Usually that's money, right? So if I can tell a CFO who thinks he doesn't need to spend money on IT governance that this overall program can potentially save him X amount of dollars, or if I'm tracking how much money on average I've saved clients, right? That's something that I can speak to. The other kind of key one would be being able to speak towards compliance. So especially if I'm dealing with somebody who's regulated by an outside entity, take a financial institution, healthcare, right, regulated by HIPAA, GDPR being one for dealing with anything within kind of the UK, European region. All those businesses have to be in compliance with those regulatory bodies, right? So if I can speak the language of making you compliant with those regulatory bodies and helping you to kind of achieve your compliance goals as well as your financial goals, then subscribing to my service almost becomes kind of a no-brainer, or instituting governance and risk management in your organization, period, really starts to make a lot more sense.
Thank you very much.
Good question.
Hi, good morning. It's me, Adarsh. And I have a question. When we talk about the organization and its structure, we also talk about its organization drivers, which run it, which is the vision, mission, and the values. Please, can you tell me that how these organization drivers are important for ISMS?
That's a good question. So I think this kind of ties back to what we talked a little bit about earlier about, as security professionals, we need to understand the goals of the business, right? So you're putting those into words, right? Into that understanding, what is the business's vision statement? What is the business's operational goals? Every business has a way that they make money, right? If businesses didn't make money, they wouldn't exist, right? So understanding that this business exists to make money in some form or capacity. So even as a security professional, we should understand our business and how they make money. And then we need to tailor our recommendations, towards either protecting the way they make money, increasing the efficiency of how they make money, or supporting the way that they make money, right? IT and risk management is, unless you work for an MSSP, IT and risk management is never the primary focal point, right? We are a supporting role in 90% of businesses, right? So understanding that we are a supporting role and understanding that what is the primary role, who is the star of the show, and how can we best support the star of the show is how we're going to get the things that we want done through the finish line.
Okay, thank you. But I have one more question for you. When we talk about the communication, both the internal and external one, these are important for any organization to run. Please, can you tell me that how the communication plan are made?
Yeah, so communication plans should be made. So that's a good question. It ties back to our policy stage, right? So when should you make policies in general? You should not make policies when you're in the middle of a security incident, right? So your communication plan should not be drafted when you're midway through a security incident and you're trying to figure out how to communicate. So this is where it ties back to that planning stage, and that the reason that I put policies and procedures first on our list today is it's something that should be done preemptively. It's something that should be done ahead of time, and it's something that should be practiced. So when you're creating your policies, that's where that incident response team, business continuity team, whatever it may be, needs to come together in that policy creation phase and understand, are we beholden to any type of communication? Do we have any requirements in our business that say we must communicate, if a customer's data is accessed, we have 8 hours to communicate that to the customer? Are we beholden to anything like that or not? All of that needs to be understood in the beginning. You then draft your communication policy to incorporate, what do you think is going to give you the best brand reputation? What do you think is going to kind of make you compliant with your regulators? What is the best communication platform for your vertical and your industry, and what's common within your industry? And as security professionals, we're not going to know all of the answers. That's where that team comes together, right? That's where you have marketing, legal, operations, all of those people come together to create that communications policy ahead of time, right? Hopefully years, decades before there's ever a security incident. And it's just being reviewed every year, right? Which then leads to the second piece is, well, how do you know it works? We should do things like tabletop exercises and training to where we then conduct an exercise, right? So we do tabletops. We can run through tabletop exercises with that information response team and walk through their communication plan and see if that actually makes sense in the event of a live engagement, right? Let's take, for example, your communication plan includes making phone calls via your VoIP phone system, right? But you have a security incident that takes down your network. Are you going to be able to use your VoIP phones, right? No, you're not. So your communication plan is not all inclusive. It's not actually going to work. So you need to revisit your communication plan and determine if there are improvements that can be made to work in the event of a security incident, right? Something I see very common is organizations have an incident response plan and they keep it in SharePoint and nobody has it printed out. And then they lose their computers because they got ransomware. Well, how do you get to your information response plan, right? How do you get to that? It's in SharePoint. You can't access your computer. Somebody needs to print that thing out, right? Have a hard copy somewhere. Things like that. So that's where those tabletop exercises really help to train. I know we went a little bit off of just communication, but some other key pieces.
Yeah, thank you so much. But just one more question. So the communication plan should be a part of incident response plan, or should it be a different documentation?
In my professional opinion, it should be part of your incident response plan. So one, that you ensure that it's reviewed annually and it isn't something that kind of lives off on its own. And two, for the sake of when are you going to use your communication response plan, right? It's going to be within your incident, in the event of an incident. It behooves you to have everything kind of all together in one place. So in my opinion, it should be kind of a subset of the incident response plan, kind of a sub policy within that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. But again, everybody kind of has their own take on policies and how many policies to have, what should be independent, what shouldn't. So really, it's this kind of goes back to tailoring things towards your organization and your company's kind of culture and approach, and then your experience, right? You will develop your own experience and your own professional opinion. That's just mine.
Hi, this is Ganesh here again. So like my doubt is, in order to keep secure in order to make our company more secure, we'll bring down some most secure policies into effect. But those policies may be hard for our users to access our company's website or companies, their details, etc. So how to overcome these kind of issues?
So I think, it really comes down to the balance of operations and security. I think, I like to say, and Lokesh has heard me say this before, that sometimes security is the enemy of operations. And so that really comes down to sometimes the most secure is not actually the most effective, right? Sometimes the most effective is not the most secure, right? If you were to leave things up to just developers, they would have no security whatsoever because it's easier for them to do their job, right? If you leave it up to just security professionals, you'd never even have access to the internet because then I don't have to worry about anything, right? So what's the balance that we kind of keep in place there? And that really comes down to kind of being a team and understanding, how do your operational teams need to operate? How do your customers need to access data? How does your website need to be utilized? And how can you ensure that you're protecting against the most operationally targeted threats without necessarily going overboard to the point where you can't use it? And that's kind of, that answer is going to change in every single scenario, right?
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
So I think that's it. Students?
Sir, I'd like to ask one more thing.
Okay.
You as a vendor.
Okay, last one. Not in.
I know we're going to go over, but I'm free if that helps.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
So, sir, you as a vendor perform assessment and support organizations and companies to keep their assets cyber safe. But how do you really ensure that the companies really adhere to your guidelines or follow your reports and implement all the mitigations? Because in case of a breach or in case of a cyber incident, your company or the third party vendor would be the first organization to be blamed for the breach.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's kind of multiple schools of thought that you could go down for that. The first really being, so if you're a company that's going to come in, do an assessment, present a report, and then leave, there's really no ability for them to blame you because all you did was an assessment and you provided them a report. Overall ownership of that organization and its security protocols fall to that organization, right? The second school of thought would be around, and the way that I prefer to do business is in a more long-term consulting engagement, which is the way we operate in my organization most of the time. We don't just do a security assessment, give you a report, and then leave. We do a security assessment, and we do it in a 12-month engagement, right? So not only are we doing a security assessment in the beginning, we are doing the assessment, we're presenting you the plan, and we're acting as kind of a project manager to ensure that the recommendations that we make from that assessment are actually implemented. And that comes down to going back to that kind of continuous monitoring. We should be reassessing, right? So it's not just a one and done assessment. When we go do a follow-up assessment, we should be assessing against those findings that we had from the first assessment. You'll see the same thing with penetration tests. So a lot of organizations that conduct penetration tests, they will include a retest in 3 months as part of the engagement. So we're going to do, let's say, a 2-week penetration test, and we're going to get a bunch of findings that come out of that pen test. We're then going to give you 2, 3, 4 months to remediate things. And then we're going to come back and do just a really quick penetration test where we're only going to test those things that we originally found to ensure that you actually mitigated those and that you actually completed that.
Right. But sir, as you mentioned earlier also, sometimes companies do fail to give all the necessary information. For example, in case of a network assessment, they don't share all the details, all the assets with you, just to make sure the pricings are low, or just to make sure that you only cover all the critical assets. But there is a high probability that the smaller or the non-critical assets also get targeted, and they are the main reasons of breach. So in such cases, when the breach occurs, what would you as a third party vendor say? Because if there is a breach in an organization, the first blame would be coming to the vendor who is providing cybersecurity support.
Yeah, I think that is a very key or a very tricky situation, right? And that's something that really comes down to, and this isn't a great answer, and I know that this isn't the answer you're going to love, but a lot of that comes down to contracts, and it comes down to clearly defined scopes in the beginning. So it really comes down to having a good statement of work, having a good, your SOW, having clear deliverables outlined within SOWs. When you're doing those types of engagements, you need to clearly define those things ahead of time to where you are very clear to the organization of what is in scope and out of scope. And anything that's out of scope, it's unfortunately, and again, not the answer that you're going to love and not the answer that I love as a security professional, that's unfortunately not on you, right? I can't help you with things that aren't in scope, right? I can only help you with the things that are in scope. I'm happy to do a new SOW and bring more things into scope if you are willing to increase cost and things like that, right? But to your point of the organization trying to cut costs, only focus on critical assets, we could spend years going down the rabbit hole of trying to find the things that are not in scope. But ultimately, that's not what you're being paid to do. And you are also a business, right? And this ties back to how do we make money? And so obviously being as forthcoming as possible ahead of time, right? So if an organization presents you with kind of an asset inventory and they say, we only want these 10 things in scope, you as a security professional should make recommendations that are appropriate. Hey, these other assets can lead to lateral movement within your environment that do compromise your critical assets if they have vulnerabilities as well. So that could be primary reasons for a breach. Those are things that you should have conversations on in the scoping call, but it really does come down to clear contracts and clear scope. And that's not an amazing answer, but that is something that it's kind of, you got to cover yourself as well.
So basically, this is the one which saves you from legal obligations or issues.
Yep. And that's why legal plays an important role on both sides of the fence.
Right. Okay, then. Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, sir. How could we track down our data with the third parties?
So a couple things, I think, obviously third-party risk, and which is why it's becoming more prevalent, is something that's very hard to mitigate because you are somewhat reliant on the third party to be forthcoming with you, right? So to the previous conversation we just had, if they're not forthcoming, you're not going to know everything. So understanding companies with brand reputation. So this is where brand reputation does play a key role, right? In your choosing of a vendor, as well. There's also certifications, like I mentioned earlier, that organizations can get when they're getting SOC 2 compliant, right? If I'm going to look for an organization, I'm going to look for one that has compliance frameworks that I'm familiar with and trust, right? So I'm going to look for a third party that is SOC 2 compliant, things like that. Maybe they're ISO 27001 compliant. They're not just, Bob's business that exists and does absolutely nothing that I've ever heard of, right? It's an organization that does something that I know, I'm familiar with. It's, even if it's not a Microsoft or an Apple or something like that, it's something that I'm familiar with and I understand, and they have certifications that they've gotten. That will help to outline where data is stored, what controls are in place, right? Requesting those things. Also running through due diligence and sending out due diligence questionnaires. And then we're going to get back to contracts a little bit and understand that this is where risk transference really comes into play, and using risk transference as a mitigation strategy. And if you have a vendor third party and you go through their SOC 2 report and you do a due diligence questionnaire and they say that all of your data is stored within the confines of your home country, right? Let's say all the data is stored within India. And then you suffer a breach and find out that your data was stored in China and that's where it was accessed, and that's not where your data was supposed to be stored. It kind of comes down to, and that's why contracting is a part of the vendor management cycle, is having risk transference nomenclature within your contracts that state, in the event of a data breach, what is your responsibility? What is the vendor's responsibility? If you have key concerns about data storage, get those into the contract, right? Have those things part of your contract with that vendor. Again, you're not necessarily going to know all the time, but that's really kind of the tricky game that we play with third-party risk.
Okay, I think we are over the time. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you once again, and it was very great session, sir. Actually, the thing is that as a risk analysis is a very theoretical part, right, sir? But you have give us a very great example of how we can quantify in the analysis. Like you have given the example of laptops and under risk assessment, right, sir? It was a really very great session with your experience, sir, and thank you for sharing such a great knowledge with our student as well, sir. Thank you very much once again from our organization and from myself as well, sir. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor.
Yes. And thank you very much, Lokesh.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. He is one
Thank
of
you
our
all.
bright students, sir. He is our alumni. Yeah.
He's my shining star. He's the one I give
Yes,
all the
yes.
hard jobs.
Yes, sir.
Thank you all. Thank you all
Uh,
very much.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your evening.
Yeah, sir. You too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.